Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Melanin Margin, the weekly chat show where conversations about race are never off the table. We're your hosts, Quaviondre Williams.
And Daquon Wilson.
So let's get into this week's conversation. What's hot on the table this week?
In an article on CNN written by Stephen Collinson, we learned that Senator Mitch McConnell's frozen moment renews questions about America's aged leaders. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell's words dried up and he froze, standing silent and staring straight ahead for around 30 painful seconds in the middle of a press conference Wednesday, the second time he had endured such an uncomfortable on camera ordeal since July. His misfortune immediately revived questions about his health and age, especially since he suffered a concussion in a fall earlier this year. His office insisted Wednesday that the veteran senator had simply been feeling, quote unquote, momentarily lightheaded. The issue of whether someone is too old to serve is a discomforting one since it involves discussing private health issues and mortality. An Associated Press survey released this week found that 77% of Americans think Biden is too old to be effective for 4 more years. Former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, for instance, is proposing a mental competency test for politicians over the age of 75 as she beseeches Americans in her GOP primary campaign to embrace a new generation of leadership. Yet the age of some key leaders does beg the question whether their refusal to ride into the sunset is thwarting the rise of a new generation of politicians, or whether younger figures in both parties lack the talent and the drive to push them aside. So let's start the conversation there, Andre. Do
Mhm.
you think that the refusal of older generations is stopping the rise of younger politicians in office? Or are there just not enough young people getting into politics?
Um, I do think that the older generation is definitely trying to stop the next generation of politicians from coming into office because many of those in the old guard, so to speak, fear the new or the unknown. This is hardly a surprise given the pattern of progress throughout the generations. Society as a whole is a metaphorical creature of habit. It likes routine because routine is familiar. It's what it's used to. It's the known. Any progress that has been made over the course of society has hardly, if ever, been met with open arms. It's been a constant battle to make progress and maintain it because when we look at the older generation of people in power, oftentimes they want to keep things exactly the way they've always been. This is because they consider the old way to be the safest, most reasonable lifestyle because it's the lifestyle that they've grown accustomed to, the world that they were raised in. And changing that world or bringing in a new perspective forces those in the older generation to look at their past with clear eyes and not through the rose colored nostalgic lenses that we can sometimes remember our past to be. Many older people don't like being confronted with the reality that things change. Ideas continue evolving, and the world keeps moving forward because they are afraid that this will somehow render them obsolete in the new world the next generation creates. But sometimes it's more insidious than that. Sometimes the real fear of the older generation, particularly those with privilege, is that many of them are accustomed to the benefits that oppression has granted them. They want to maintain the isms so that both themselves and their family line can continue retaining all the power they've held. To make matters worse, because of how embedded the isms are in the very fabric of our nations, even those who are oppressed by them still wish to uphold them. Excuse me, Clarence Thomas. Oh, I'm so sorry. Excuse me,
Oh,
Daquon.
you can say that again.
I was,
We don't know.
it was a cough, Daquan. I don't know where that cough came up. Excuse me, y'all, but they wish to uphold them not because they benefit from it, but because it's their routine. They've been forced to build their life, shape their personalities, raise their families to work within these isms. And for that to change would challenge the very core of their being, which is a challenge that very few people in the older generation can get up to face, because every time we try to push the needle forward, unlearn and dismantle the isms, there are those in the older generation who push back twice as hard to keep those isms in place. So yes, I do think that the older generation is fighting with everything in their power to stop the younger generation from taking political power, just as the next generation will fight the one following it, and so on and so forth. As much as we would all like to think that change or progress is made simply through peaceful conversations and thought-provoking discussions, in our society, that is very rarely the case. More often than not, the next generation has to take a stand and fight against the old powers in place and force the needle forward. It's just the way it's always been, and likely the way it always will be. There are plenty of young politicians trying to take office, but again, the old guard is trying to keep them out. But they can bar the windows, lock the doors all they like. We'll bulldoze our way through one way or another. So they can either get on board or stay the fuck out of the way, because progress is going to fucking happen, whether they like it or not. But Daquan, I'm gonna pass it back to you. What do you think?
I think that, of course, this is a situation where a lot of things are happening.
Yeah.
I think that there we have to realize the state of politics that young people would be getting into in the first place. I mean, politics right now are as divided as it's ever been. Everything is a controversial issue. There's no middle ground anymore. There are very polarized opinions. And so it can be really hard to get into politics. Not to mention, we of course know that the younger generation has been burdened more with student loan debt, for
Mm-hmm.
instance. There's been a stagnation with wages,
Mm-hmm.
inflation has been going up, and you have all of those financial factors compiling on the younger generation who would get into politics,
Yeah.
but feasibly and fiscally cannot. Because we know, incumbents, especially those older incumbents, have huge pockets of donors slapping so much money into their campaigns that it is a mountain to try to unseat an incumbent. And also, we hear stories, for example, Representative Maxwell Frost, who is one of the only Gen Zers in office right now at that level, who talked about how hard it was for him just to afford housing in DC. So there are so many issues that are discouraging a lot of young people from getting into politics. But we also know that there are also a lot of young people who definitely have the talent, who definitely have the drive, who definitely have that passion to make things work. And what really happens, like you said before, is the old guard not relinquishing power to the new guard, pushing back against the new guard, in fact, because we know politics is a numbers game. So
Mm-hmm.
there are so many times when there are politicians who would rather keep their seats versus retiring and potentially giving it up a seat for their team, rather than thinking about who can really do the job the best and do the job most effectively. And so it's really sad to see that a lot of these older generation of politicians just are latching onto power and don't want to give it up. But it's not surprising, because that comes with the nature of power. When people have power, they don't want to give it up. They want to still be the ones making the decisions, because at the end of the day, so many politicians, despite what they say, are in it for themselves. They're not in it for the best interests of their constituents. They're not in it to have this grand view of what the world can be. They want to keep their power. They want to line their pockets. They want to make sure that they are good and their family is good, and generations after them will still be good because
Hmm.
they had the power to control what our society does and how we move forward or backwards, as unfortunately often it is as a society.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's also that conversation about people thinking about age limits for these
Mhm.
politicians. And, I don't know about age limits because that can teeter on the line of ageism.
Right.
However, I am a firm believer in the fact that there should be term limits for every position of political power in our society, specifically those appointed to the Supreme Court. A Supreme Court member should not have a lifetime appointment. Point blank, period.
Period.
I've done some research onto why members of the Supreme Court are appointed for a lifetime, and Kevin Wagner from the Palm Beach Post says that, quote, the primary reason is to remove them from political pressures. This is intended to help ensure that decisions they make are guided by law and judgment rather than trying to placate political interests to save their jobs, end quote. Now, theoretically speaking, that does seem like a good idea because you don't want people voted in who will sway the law in favor of whoever's political agenda had the deepest pockets for their campaign. However, the problem is a lifetime appointment isn't the solution to that issue. The reason that this is because it fails to take into account that people by design are moved by our own personal biases, beliefs, and prejudices. It's the reason why laws are always changing, why religious texts are always debated, and why language continues to evolve. We're not machines. We are thinking, feeling beings, and those feelings and thoughts shape who we are and what we do and how we interpret the world around us. It's why people can go through the same situation and have completely different experiences of it because we all see the world through our own biased lenses. Not to mention that some of the members who are appointed were appointed with the express purpose of overturning laws that directly benefit a particular, political party or a religious agenda. Impartiality when it comes to the interpretation or reviewing of law is not entirely possible, as evident by the fact that several laws that were deemed constitutional at one point in time have now been overturned at a different point in time. Sometimes in really positive ways, like desegregation, the right to marry being expanded to include LGBTQIA persons and interracial relationships, as well as making discrimination unlawful. And sometimes in negative ways, like the overturning of Roe v. Wade and ending affirmative action. Supreme Court justices are moved by the political climate of the world around them in the same way that the average everyday person is. To believe otherwise is to ignore the fact that throughout several lifetimes, we've seen just how much laws are changed based on the views of the world we live in. All that a lifetime appointment ensures is that members of the Supreme Court are able to continue imposing their personal beliefs into laws of our ever evolving society. But what do you think about that, Daquon? Do you believe that there should be an age limit on politicians?
I do not. I agree with you that I don't necessarily believe in age limits, but rather term limits.
Hmm.
I think that age limits, like you say, can lean deeply into ageism as well as ableism, because when we think about what is an appropriate age limit, what are the metrics that we are going by? Are we going by physical capabilities, which in that instance could limit the people who have a physical disability, even if they are within the age limit? Are we going by mental capabilities? Once again, that could render anybody who has some type of mental disability ineligible, even if they are within that age limit. And even so, not only how are we creating these metrics, but what person is creating the metrics or the test for the metrics? For example, Nikki Haley's mental proficiency test. Who is creating that test? Because we know that this country has a long history with creating different barriers using tests to limit access to power. And this could be a test that could specifically rule out anybody with not only disabilities, but people from lower income backgrounds, people who might not be as educated from a collegiate level or law degrees, et cetera, et cetera. And so, in essence, there really is no good way to create an age limit that doesn't, in consequence, disenfranchise a group of people. And I also wanted to speak on your topic of the Supreme Court because
Hmm.
that is a very interesting topic because we know that the Supreme Court have these lifetime appointments and it's supposed to be impartial. But the reality is it's not. It's not impartial at all. Not only do people have individual biases that are internal to them and just implicit as a human being, everybody has some type of bias. We have to work through our biases, but everybody is going to have that initial bias. But we also know that there are Supreme Court justices that have been, in their city girl era getting flued out and
Daquon.
and
Not that
it's
city girl era.
the city girl era and it's political bribery in essence. And so we still have Supreme Court justices who are pressured by politics to make certain decisions, even if it's not outside politicians, it's their own politics that are pressuring them into making certain decisions and not being completely impartial when it comes to law. And I think that there's also the element of power and who we are giving power to. Because when we give the Supreme Court this power to overturn laws and do X, Y, and Z, and they can do it for their entire lifetime, that is a lot of power. And who's to say that the Supreme Courts and the people of the United States are always going to be in agreement? Because last I checked that this country was founded for the people. It's
Hmm.
supposed to be a democracy and people's voices are supposed to matter. So
Hmm.
when we have decisions like Roe v. Wade and all of the recent Supreme Court decisions that have been causing so much controversy,
Especially with the overwhelming majority of Americans disagreeing with the decision.
right? It really begs the question, are we a country for the people? Are we actually able to have our voices be heard and get the representation we deserve when anything that we say we want can just get overturned by a Supreme Court because they say, no, I don't like that law. Get it out the books.
Exactly.